Hello, Peter. It's lovely to meet with you again virtually.
Yeah.
We really enjoyed your presentation to us in June of last year. I'm so glad that you're able to join us today and that we could include you in the program. We very much appreciate your presence and input. With a man of your stature in the trauma world, it is difficult for someone like me to give you an introduction that is adequate, fitting, and has not been heard before. You are so well known. It's a bit like saying, "This is John Lennon. He composes and sings very well indeed." In your case, I could say, "This is Dr. Peter Levine. He heals and teaches very well indeed." My journey into the world of trauma began in 2015 when my wife was diagnosed with a stress-related illness.
Mm.
Your book, Waking the Tiger, was one of the first of about 50 which I read during that time,
Mm.
and which influenced me to create Action Trauma to help others in the world. You wrote many more books, most of which I have also read. We particularly researched trauma healing, which you pioneered with the mind-brain-body connection. I know that you have studied in depth the influence of events and circumstances that our ancestors have experienced during their lifetimes, and how those subsequently affect us and our children. I am really looking forward to your talk on this.
Well, thank you, Clive. Thank you for the kind introduction. Actually, I've never received an introduction quite like that. So, and also, I'm really taken by the subject of the conference on intergenerational trauma, because if I think back when I first started to write about intergenerational trauma in the late 1980s, I was really being dismissed as fringe, as something that was really, that was basically absurd. I mean, you couldn't have trauma that was passed on from generation to generation.
Mhm.
And here now there's a conference devoted to that. So times they are changing. Times they are
Yes,
changing.
yes,
Uh,
indeed.
yeah. So, um, you know, making the invisible visible is to me what generational trauma is about. Also, it's not just trauma, but we receive all kinds of vital information and knowing from our ancestral line. And I'll show you a demonstration at one point here of working with actually two people at the same time, both from the First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and really, and these are people who really consider it ordinary that we're talking about influences from the ancestors, not just the trauma, but great wisdom that also gets transmitted. So I'll
Yeah.
give a short demonstration of, of working with that. So I'd like to just share with you a few slides. Um, some of this was a workshop that I did with one of my students, one of the somatic experiencing teachers, Efu, from Brazil. And she comes from a tribal background. And so these kinds of things that we're going to be talking about were second nature to her. So let me start with our PowerPoint. Here we go. So how did I really get started about understanding generational trauma? Well, there basically were two events that were pivotal. One was in 1989. I was working with a young woman who was in an airplane crash, and this is somewhat of a famous crash. The movie Fearless was based on this air disaster, and So I worked with her. Can you imagine the trauma? I mean, the plane made a crash landing. The fuselage broke up. There were big fireballs, and she was upside down in the piece of the fuselage, and she then let herself down. And there was almost the entire fuselage was collapsed, except for one small window. And she's able to identify it as a point of light. So she heard the words in her mind, because again, she was trapped. The other parts had already started to explode. And she said she heard in her mind the voice both of her father and of her grandfather saying, "Go to the light, go to the light." And she did, and that saved her life. What was interesting, actually quite interesting, is that both her father and grandfather were in airplane crashes, and both of them had escaped by moving towards a point of light. So again, it's not, of course, we were working with the trauma, but when this ancestral information came in, it really made it clear to me that it's not just the trauma that can be transmitted, but some deep wholenesses that we can go from haunting to wholeness. So this is just an illustration, an image of how we are connected from generation to generation. I'm maybe just taking a moment just to allow this image to impact on you and see what effect it has when you see it. Are you touched by it? In what way might you be touched by it? So in our connection with our ancestors, we are not separated by space or time, that we are literally connected to everybody and everything in the entire planet. And that's one of the reasons why there are no wars to end wars, because we keep repeating and repeating and repeating, I guess you could say, until we get it right. Also, in the upper part of the image, you'll see DNA, an image of DNA. And one of the things that are very, very clear is that our stress responses are passed on from generation to generation in terms of the epigene, not just the GNA, but the modulators that allow the DNA to be expressed. This is really a very, very important concept. This is one of my favorite images. It's from a book by Hildegard von Bingen. And what I say is that we are energy fields embedded within larger energy fields, embedded in ancestral energy fields, and embedded in universal energy fields. So again, just taking a few moments to connect with that idea and see how it resonates in your bodies, these images of energy fields. But they're not just only energy fields, they're informational fields. So they're energy and informational fields. Yeah, and this is from a book that I'm in the process of writing. It's called An Autobiography of Trauma. So I wrote in the book, I later came to comprehend that we are all informed by energy fields, which are embedded in larger energy fields and connected to the energy fields of others and to the cosmos. And further, that these energy fields carry within them all the knowledge and great wisdom of the ages. This universal source of knowledge has been variously called the Akashic Records and can first be found in a book in 1883 on esoteric Buddhism. The question is, how do we access these universal records and utilize their powerful information? And again, in a bit, I will show you some films that were recorded when I was teaching a workshop at Esalen Institute on this, in this subject. Yes. We are all moved by the energy fields of a system where we are connected to a deeper layer of mind, which is not normally accessible, but is accessible through the ancestral lineage. Whoa. And not only is it in the direction of our ancestors, but it goes in both directions. That so often when we heal our traumas, then we are also helping to heal their traumas. And it goes in space and time in all different possible directions. Forward, backwards, left, right, time going forward, time going backwards. Einstein really helped us understand that time is not a linear thing that just goes along. It's something that really permeates in space-time continuum. Yes. And a person who really clearly understood this was C.G. Jung, Carl Jung. And in his essay on psychological types, the book, wrote that all experiences are represented which have happened on this planet since primeval times. He added, the more frequent and the more intense they were, the more clearly focused they become in the archetype and become embedded within the psychic structures, within the body-mind, I would add. Yes, I said something about this just a little bit before, about the role of epigenetics in transgeneral trauma. And, you know, this again, it has become a very vibrant field right now, a very field that's now being researched in many parts of the world in terms of genomic expression and in terms of how these systems get modulated. I mean, we know, for example, I mean, it really is basically common sense. Think about this. We have the same DNA in every part of our body. So the DNA in my brain and my liver and my skin, it's the same DNA, but the expression is quite different, right? You know, we're not all livers, we're not all brains, hopefully. But so there must be some way to modulate the genes, and that's again a key work in understanding these effects and going beyond just that to what a person named Sheldrake, Rupert Sheldrake, who talked about morphic fields and morphic resonances. And he did this kind of interesting experiment many years ago, I think at least 20 years ago. And he taught, a group of rats were taught to run a maze in Sydney, Australia. And then they timed how long it took them to learn that maze. Then the same strain of rats in New York were also, after this, were put in the same maze. And though it was small, it was statistically significant that they learned the maze in a shorter time. And oh, well, you say, well, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, everything is faster in New York, but it works the other direction. So if the rats in New York are taught the maze first, then the ones in Sydney actually are more rapid learners. But again, this is just learning a maze. What happens when there's an upheaval, a holocaust, a war, tremendous emotional disruption? Well, that's going to be transmitted to the entire world community. So again, if you just think about this, how it expands out in all space and all time, then we realize we're in very nonlinear dimension. Yes, okay, so it was 1981 when he first did it. It was much more than 20 years ago. Okay. So how do we heal these generational trauma? We brought together two basic tools here. The somatic experiencing approach, which is the method that you mentioned, Clive, that I've developed over the past 45 years, and some tremendous insights from family constellation, and how they really, really do fit together. And that's Bert Hellinger's work, who not so long ago passed in his mid-90s, really quite a visionary person. So again, we really use these tools to bring together these two streams of understanding, of wisdom, really. I mentioned this. So again, how we can begin to uncover the invisible and to make the invisible visible. And we are bonded by a deep love to our parents and their parents to their parents. And children will often sacrifice their own best interests in a vain attempt really, to ease the suffering of a parent or other family member. And you'll see this also in generational work, that when the child is able to begin to heal, or when they are stuck, that if we're able to find what the previous generational influences would need in their life to heal their trauma, then that can come back and heal our trauma. Again, vice versa, as we heal our trauma, we're also healing our ancestors' trauma. Again, this is something that's not considered, usual, but really empirically we find this is tremendously and vitally true. These are some of the things where, how do we suspect that there might be important general influences? Well, there are. So you make that assumption because it's true. And that children will stay so loyal to their parents. And for that reason, they often repeat the same errors, the same mistakes of their parents. And then they have a difficulty in achieving a more fulfilling life than their parents. So they really, in a way, they won't go through, they have a difficulty to go beyond where the ancestors were stuck, because out of the love for our ancestors. So can we experience the love without the limitations? So the idea, again, is using principles of healing generational trauma through our body awareness and our psychic awareness. We can break these patterns and then can live and be born into a more fulfilled life. Now, often, and I'm kind of been a victim of that myself, we tend to be ego-driven, and we don't really honor our ancestors And healing really requires that we honor them. And we do this in great reverence. And again, so many ancestral peoples know this. This is just part of their life, that you give honor to the ancestors. And again, that's part of the dynamic healing process. Yes, and here again is an image, and you see this in so many different religions and spiritual traditions, that we give reverence to all those who came before us. And there's an order of love where there's a balance between receiving and giving, receiving from the ancestors and giving to the ancestors, and vice versa. And again, the ego can interfere with that because it's all about us. It's not all about us. We're one small little drop in this ocean of energy and knowing. We're just this little teeny dot. It may not feel so good at first, but folks, that is the reality. And when we know this, when we can honor this and honor our ancestors and open to these energy and knowing fields, the ego begins to dissolve and we connect with the wholeness of being. And there are different ways in which these orders can be thwarted, unwittingly though, in many ways. So again, when children feel pity, which is not a healthy emotion, feel pity for their parents and want to give them love to help them. And you see that when kids are not getting the love that they should be getting from their parents, they will love their parents so that the parents can love them. Of course, this is something that won't work out. And then also, when the children refuse to receive from their parents this wisdom and healing because of resentments, anger, pain, and or pride, resentments towards our parents. And that's okay. We do have resentments, and we don't want to hide them. We don't want to hide the anger. We don't want to hide the grief or the pride, but we have to understand that that's not the whole picture. It really, really isn't. And, you know, I just think about my own experience with my parents. There was a lot of anger towards my parents and towards what they didn't give me and towards deep traumas that occurred. But I also was aware of what kinds of great wisdom that they gave me. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, about grief. When children or young adults die and are not adequately mourned, that also affects the whole generational picture. Also, I'm often asked about, you know, what happens when children are adopted, and that this is no longer talked about. You know, and because in many ways, people are, you know, the new parents, the adoptive parents, you know, and often they're just they're very young children or even babies or infants, you know, that are adopted. But it really, what we deny, that it also is coming from our biological parents through their DNA. And so this will come up. And children, you know, even adopted as infants, there's something haunting them. You know, there's something that just doesn't let them feel complete, that again has from denying and grieving over the biological parents. So I think what I'd like to do now, because I want to make sure I have time for this. Whoa. All right. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to open this, and I'm going to. Okay. Let me make sure you can see this. Okay. EX. Okay. So I'm going to share, new share. Ah, here we go. Ah, why is this not? Let me go back here again. Oh, here, maybe this is, no. No, let me close this one. How about that? Yeah. It's going to always be a little confusing here. Whoop. All right. So I'm going to click on this. This will stop if they're a bit. There's no way of, yeah. Okay. So let's go back here. All right, let me try this one more time. Share screen. Here we go. Voila. Okay, so this is a session that I did at a workshop I did a few years ago at the Ashland Institute in Big Sur, California. And the young man is from the Crow Nations. And the young woman is from the Navajo Nation. And so I begin, well, by talking a little bit about their language. One of the tremendous traumas that was inflicted upon the indigenous people in North America, in the United States and Canada, is that the children were taken away from their parents and sent to schools run by the government, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they were not allowed to speak their language. If they were caught speaking their language, they would make them eat soap, chew on soap, to make sure they would not use their language again. So this cut them off from their ancestors, because it's language, which often is one of the connecting vectors to our ancestors. So I start working with them together. Do you speak sometimes in your native language now?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually this past year I took my kids out of school and starting a language immersion program.
Oh, wow.
On our own. So
you're organizing that.
And,
wow.
To reclaim the education, the type of education I want to teach my children, and through the language.
Oh, wow. When you say that, I just feel so moved.
Yeah, it's pretty, it's beautiful.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And I think that's...
So again, you see she's really beginning to connect with her ancestors, and that she's using that to give the children their education that is from the ancestral education.
It's, it's healing.
Uh-huh.
It's when you speak it, when you're around it, and when you live it. It's everything is so holistic.
They installed different Navajo young men with the different regimens, and they would make the communication between them just in their language, but it was so complex that the Germans couldn't get through it at all. And it's really an indication that without the code talkers, the war might have gone in the other way. There's just a couple of seconds here that got skipped over. During the Second World War, people, not only actually from the Navajo, but I didn't know this from the Crow and other tribes as well, that had unwritten languages. They would have one person, one code talker in the field and another one at the base. And so they could communicate with each other in that language. And the code talkers were given cyanide pills. So if ever they were going to be captured, they would commit suicide so that the code couldn't be broken. I think about this, and also the soldiers, if they were in any danger of getting caught, would kill the code talkers. So they really gave so much. They gave their lives to the war effort through their language, and their language that had been taken away from them as children. I mean, just think about that. Really, when I think about that, I just am impacted so deeply. I feel my whole body affected. So this is incredible. Again, a story that the language that has such nuance and complexity. And to say you can't do that anymore.
She had no control. At that time, that was the only way. That was just a given that children have to go to school, and they wouldn't see their parents or their land for long extended times. But it's horrible. Can you imagine speaking English being sent away to some place and totally forced to speak another language as a child, forced to conform to a religion, forced to act a certain way. Were
you also in the schools, or?
My uncle was actually taken from the family, my mother's brother, and then sent to must have been over 500 miles to another state.
They knew what was right.
And there were, besides the Navajo Crow talkers, there were a few other tribes, and Crow was one of them. It's not widely, but we had code talkers in World War II as well, and their distant relatives. And I got to go to an honoring ceremony at Congress in 2014, I think. And all the code talkers had passed, but they gave the medal to the families to finally thank them.
So again, not only honoring the relatives, but then also the people who caused so much trauma, to belatedly honor them.
And it was 70 years after the fact.
Oh, gosh.
And my grandfather served in World War II for the U.S. and was stationed in New Guinea. So it was very personal, and he helped raise me.
Wow. Maybe just let's be with our sensations and feelings for a little bit here. Notice the breath, and the eyes open, and then she goes in as well. And just allowing time for this to happen. What a blessing that you had this parents and grandparents that gave you this gift, protected you both. I have an idea. Again, if it doesn't feel right in any way, let me know. Because I'm thinking about these relatives, these ancestors, and how they live in you. And maybe to just be able to put them out in space a little bit might be helpful. So the idea here, I'm just kind of borrowing this. I won't be doing it the way they do it, but just borrowing the idea of putting those family members, those ancestors out in a position in the room. So in other words, to just pick somebody who might be representing your mother, your father, grandfather, and then just have them come up and just be there to represent their presence, their essence.
And that's your crow forever.
Mm. Oh. So maybe just saying those words. You're good.
You're good. You're okay.
I'm going to protect you.
I'm going to protect you.
And you'll grow forever.
And you'll grow forever.
Even you hold in your heart the wisdom of the crow. Sorry.
I do hold the wisdom of the crow in my heart.
Yeah.
I don't know any other way to be.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm thinking of you.
Mm.
At this time, I want you to support me and guide me. Giving thanks for where I'm at and giving thanks to continue on.
Mm. If there's any song that you would like to sing to Grandfather.
It's more of a chant.
A chant.
A chant in the ceremony.
Yeah.
Shodaji, Shodaji.
I put my foot near you. Yeah. And can Grandfather touch you?
Yeah. Yeah. Blabba, Hogashila. Balasai Chishiokudesh. Shodaji, Shodaji. Oh, Akbanadia. Oh, Akbanadia. Newa Betchish, Newa Betchish. Balasaichish, Balasaichish, hey yo, hey yo, hey. Dalasaichish, 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 Hogajila, hey yo, hey yo, hey. Be absolute, be absolute. Papum Sabagondila Shane Wabech Elishjai Wishchik Hogajila 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 Chlakshish Kodesh Babechish Achbaichish Kodajan Eya Eya Eya. Translation is hello, hello, Creator. Listen to me today. Thank you so much for being here. My heart is singing, and I know your heart is singing. And it's good. It's a good day today. It's a good morning. It's a good afternoon. And it's a good evening. Thank you for listening.
Oh, yeah. Thank you both for sharing, from your heart this great wisdom. Yeah. I don't want you to do it unless it's something that you feel okay with.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so.
Yes, thank you.
I'm stirred.
So this is sharing from the group, and I'm often very cautious about that. But again, I think because people were so deeply touched, I just allowed a little time for that.
And it was hard for me to decide whether to take the mic and speak or not, because I'm still very stirred, and I'm concerned about making this expression right now about me and my feelings. I'm trying to understand why I'm so deeply moved right now. It's really unexpected.
Okay, over here. And maybe being moved is the reason for being moved. Nope.
Thank you so much for letting me feel some of what your people have felt, even if it's just a tiny bit. Thank you for that. And I'm so sorry.
Right here. Okay. So this is something that's come. I've been doing a lot of work with healthcare workers around the COVID that's going around. And one of the things, and this is probably more, well, I think it's true in many of our cultures, that grief is something that we push away. You know, here in the US, we tend to be addicted to positivity. You know, can do, will do, but you have the stiff upper lip, you know, and all these different ways of not feeling our grief. And you could see the way the grief was felt in the entire group there. You know, I think grief is not something that's meant to be experienced through one's ego. In other words, it's not something that can be felt, because grief is too strong. It needs to be shared in community in some way. And I'm thinking about the forest people, the anthropologist Colin Turnbull. He was what was called a subjectivist anthropologist. And so not just studying the people and making notes of what they did, what their behavior is, how long they did it, you know, he allowed himself to participate. And so when somebody died or there was loss, the whole tribe would come together. And for 24 hours, they would wail and cry. 24 hours. And again, it was the whole community, not just the that individual. And then they would move into the deep forest and they would dance together in ecstasy. I had also a little bit of a personal experience with this when I was given the privilege to visit the Kranaki people in Brazil. And it took us like 15 hours to drive, then another 4.5 hours to hike into the jungle and to meet the person who was the chief. And you know, and we were dripping in sweat. I mean, we were supposed to leave at 4 o'clock in the morning, but since we were somewhat delayed, and it was hot, believe me, it was hot. So again, we come and we're just completely sweating. And he had just made a little pipe from a spring that was the first shower that they had. And so he offered us to stand under the shower to cool off, and then to sit with him under the mango tree. And he had a whole bunch of flutes, and he started playing the flute. And I asked him if it was okay. Oh, no, first he asked me why I was coming. And I said, well, because I'm interested in trauma. I'm interested in sustos. And sustos is the word in Spanish and very similarly in Portuguese for fright paralysis or soul loss. And he said yes. He knew of the term. He also knew of the word trauma. And he said, but we see trauma in a different way. The way we see trauma is that it's a rupture in the fabric of interconnectivity. It's not about what happens to a single person. And I was deeply affected by that. Then another thing happened, which was really an illustration of that, a demonstration of that. And the Kranaki people would have this this dance, this chant, and they would all do it together. And we were invited to do it with them. And it was a very simple step, and you would just go around in the circle with this step. And I have to tell you that after just several minutes, I was in an altered state of consciousness. Again, very, very simple movements. Well, there was this one woman, she was diabetic, and she was pregnant. And because it was a high-risk pregnancy, they took her to the hospital. Tragically, the twins were born still. They were dead, and she went into a profound depression. And they were going to give her electric shock treatment for the depression. So the princess, the daughter of the chief, and some of the other people went there. They fashioned a ladder and they climbed up to the window, and they rescued her and brought her back to the tribe. And she was just, again, completely inert. She was barely breathing, and she would just sit on the outside of the circle, and they would go do the chanting, the dance, and they did that several times. And then at one moment, she just started to sob and breathe and sob, and then she joined the group. So again, this idea of how important it is, how pivotal it is, that we live in communities, that we are meant to live in communities, that we are genetically disposed to being in communities, and that we've lost those communities. And in losing those communities, we've really lost the connection with ourselves, with our deeper selves. So I would say we have such great wisdom that's embodied in those energy fields for all of us, not just for tribal people, but for all of us so-called advanced peoples. You know, and again, individualism has benefit. You know, I wouldn't be sitting here with a computer being on Zoom with you in Ireland or wherever all you are. You know, without this, it wouldn't have been possible. So we need the individual, we need but at the same time, we also need cooperation. So some of these things that we think are done by individuals, they're really, really actually done, yes, with individuals, but equally with cooperation. And so connecting with the ancestors is a way of also connecting with this sharing, with this not burdening, not having this all burdened on ourselves, right? Trying to think, there was something else I wanted to say. Oh yes, I did speak of it before, but I think it's important to reiterate it. How important honoring is. Honoring our parents, honoring our grandparents, and again, helping the healing. One of the things that, again, brought me to generational trauma, when I started to work with people in the 1970s, I noticed that a group of people, not a group of people, but some people reported when we were working with the body sensations, they would have smells of burning flesh. And that didn't make any sense. Why would that be coming? Especially because some of them were vegetarians. So I had the thought to ask them about their relatives, their parents and their grandparents, what they knew about them. And a number of those people had parents that were in the Holocaust. They were Jewish, and that their parents were in the Holocaust. And they very likely smelled the burning flesh of people who were being burned. So again, how does that get transmitted? And most importantly, how do we heal from that? And there's a story also that's in my autobiography. I call it Albert and Me Encounters at the Beggar's Banquet. And the Beggar's Banquet is a restaurant in Berkeley. And I was working on my doctoral dissertation in medical biophysics at the same time also that I was working on developing somatic experiencing and the theory behind that. And so one time I was enjoying my soup and warm, crispy French bread. And I looked up and there was this old man sitting across from me. And I was like, what's going on here? But then when I just surrendered to it and allowed it to impact me, I looked and I could see this older man with a crumpled crumpled jacket with unruly hair. And I recognized that was Albert Einstein. And so for a good part of a year, every week or two, we would sit and have conversations. And I would ask him these deep, enduring questions that I was working with and struggling with. And one of the questions that I asked him was about how to work, because again, this was around the time that I was starting to realize that these traumas just went out in so many different dimensions. And I asked him, what information that would be helpful for me. So he said, well, just follow me. And so in this image, he took me to a pond, a small pond, and he had a meter stick. And on the meter stick, the yardstick, he put a whole bunch of these little stones, and he held them to right by the pond, and then turned it over, and all of the pebbles dropped at the same time. And of course, each pebble had a wave of rippling, and then they would intersect with each other as they would ripple forward. And then he said, look what happens if one of them gets stuck, if there's a fixation at one of these points. And he called these ego points. At the time, it didn't make sense, but that was exactly what he was talking about, where our egos get stuck. And then what happens is, after that point, the wave becomes distorted and gets distorted forever. And then I asked him, well, how does this apply? And he said, that, Peter, is what you will have to find out. And it became clear that if you can find enough of these fixation points and open to them so that the wave front then continues unimpeded, that's when the whole generational healing occurs in both directions, again, in space and time. So I honor Albert Einstein and give thanks. There's a little bit more to this story if I have a couple of minutes more. I happened, when I was visiting my parents some decades ago, maybe 30 years ago, and I just happened to notice the book by Albert Einstein on the theory of relativity. So I told my parents about these encounters I had with Albert Einstein. And my mother, who would have, if she were alive at this time, would have been considered to be an intuitive or even a psychic. And I told her, what had happened and how I had been taken under Einstein's wings. And she said, Peter, I know why that happened. And I said, what? She said, I know why you had those conversations. When we were pregnant with you, you were 8 months in utero, and we were on a canoe in this lake, and a wind squall came across the lake and capsized the canoe. And my parents were struggling to turn the canoe over and get back in. They were unable to do it. They were certainly to perish. But then a small sailboat came along, and there was an older man and a young woman. And they took my parents into their boat and saved their lives. It was Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter. And my mother realized that because Einstein had saved my life and their life and my life in that moment of time, that I had been connected to him in all of space-time. Go figure, right? So there is so much more to life that we don't know, but that we can begin to open to. And I just like to leave you with that thought, not just about generational trauma, but of generational healing. And thank you again for inviting me, Clive, and for being part of this really wonderful conference. And I'm hoping to be able to see you, I guess it's in June, given that conditions are okay on the ground are okay. So thank you, and thank you all for the attendees for sharing this time with me.